The Palm Beach Civic Association expands its communication outreach with a state-of-the-art television studio. We call it Studio 33480, the zip code for the beautiful island of Palm Beach. Sponsored by Finley Galleries, our goal is to bring you in-depth interviews with the most colorful and knowledgeable personalities on the island. And now, our host.
Welcome to Studio 33480. I'm Mark Zeidman, Chair of the Tax and Finance Committee. And with me today is Kirk Blouin, Town Manager for Palm Beach, to help us understand the town's budget. Thanks for coming, Kirk.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
You recently went through the budget process for the town for the new fiscal year ending September 30th, 2023. The budget is an important process that impacts the quality of life that we have in Palm Beach in all sorts of ways. So in the time that we have, I was hoping that we could talk a bit and you could help us understand some of the key decisions that were made during the budget process. Specifically, time permitting, we can cover property taxes, ad valorem taxes. Are they up or down? And if so, why? Okay. Operating expenditures for the town, same thing. Are they have they increased or decreased, and why? I'd like to cover some of the key drivers behind the decisions that were made during the budget process for comp and benefits, and talk a bit about some of the decisions that were made for undergrounding and pension expense. Mm-hmm. And last but not least, I'd like to get your thoughts on what are some of the key financial risks and opportunities facing the town going forward. Okay. So we can start wherever you'd like to start. We could start with revenues.
Sure.
What can you tell us about property taxes?
Well, you asked me the question, are property taxes going up? So to answer that in the simplest way that I can, for the non-homesteaded property tax property owners, we'll see an increase of roughly $66 per value of property, and non-homesteaded property owners will see a decrease of roughly $113 per million of value of property. Okay. But I think probably even more important to that is, particularly when it comes to finances, what are the trends? And I know you're going to, as a former CFO, you're going to get into the fine detail of some of this year's budget. But for the past 5 years, we have had no increases in property taxes for homesteaded property owners or decreases. And we've also had 5 years straight of surpluses returned and unused funds to the town. So although the preparation of the budget is funds that you think you're going to need over that fiscal year, we have a philosophy of lean government principles, and every one of those expenditures, although budgeted for, gets scrutinized by the team. They get scrutinized by me. They're placed on a council agenda for approval. So even though it's budgeted, we want to make sure that we still need to expend those funds. Mm-hmm, and we do a pretty good job of only spending what we need to meet the service needs of the community. And in other opportunities, we look for ways to increase revenues. We do have a couple of enterprise funds, the golf and marina funds that have performed very well. We run them like a business. We're trying to maximize our assets. But if there's an opportunity a little later on in the interview, I'll delve into that a little bit further.
Oh, for sure. For homesteaded properties, property taxes per million went down by about $113. For non-homesteaded properties, they went up a little bit. I think it was $66, if I recall correctly. On an overall basis, property taxes in total increased, didn't they? Went from like 59 million, the revenue.
I think we're referring to two different ways.
Yes.
You are correct. So the revenue increased. The taxes went down, but the revenues generated by the town went up by 5.8 million
Yep.
an additional property
Okay.
tax revenue or ad valorem tax revenue that we collected.
Right.
But again, let me add a little context to that.
Please.
So we all know that the town of Palm Beach has been experiencing really strong appreciation of their property values over the past several years. Particularly last year was a banner year for appreciation. The Palm Beach County Property Appraiser's Office valued the increase at 18%. But again, that has to be a meeting when how that fits within the law of what's allowed by Florida state law, and also how the town council adopts a millage rate. So under the law, under the Save the Homes Act, for a homesteaded property owner, the maximum that you can increase their property taxes on valuation is 3%. And for non-homesteaded property owners, the maximum cap is 10%. So after we develop our budget and we determine what the service needs are in the community, we have obviously very high service needs. We have a lot of employees to meet those needs. I'm a long tenured town employee, so I have a pretty good feeling of what those needs are. We're in constant conversation with members of the community and the mayor and council, and the final determination of what that budget is. So after we review the entire budget for all of the department, and the revenue sources, I think you cited the 67% of the ad valorem or property tax revenue that comes into the town. That's determined. That's a hard number that doesn't fluctuate. And then there's about a third of other revenue sources. And I might have mentioned previously most of that's generated by some of our enterprise funds and in some cases fines.
I see.
And grant money that we receive as well. So we present all of that, and sometimes there's staff-initiated new projects that are presented that we think would make us more efficient and be better able and capable to meet the needs of the community. And then there's those that are generated from the council. Most of those are already put in the budget after my conversations with them throughout the year. And sometimes there's usually final discussions, particularly over the summer months when we do our budget workshop. To determine what the budget expenses are projected to be next year, and then they look at the revenue sources and they'll adopt the millage rate. So we had I think a 7% decrease in the millage rate this year. So it went from 2.89 to 2.69. We do have the lowest millage rate in Palm Beach County, particularly because we have no additional tax and sources. We're a full service community. Meaning we have our own police department and a fire department, and some of these other departments may have a low millage rate, say like the Manalapan, who is our second closest competitor for lowest millage rate, but they have to contract out for police and fire services.
I see.
So we had a decrease in the millage rate, increase in the revenue.
But on an individual basis.
A healthy surplus.
Yep.
But we also did have an increase in our operating expenses.
Okay, let's talk about that. Operating expenses increased, I forget the exact number, something by like 11% year over year, give or take. The biggest contributor to the increase in operating expenses, not surprisingly, is comp and benefits.
Sure.
Can you tell us about that? What drove the increase in comp and benefits?
Sure. It's close to 11%. Again,
I rounded up. Didn't I?
Yes, you did. Every little bit helps.
Okay.
Like I said, we offer a lot of services here in the community. We require a lot of personnel, a lot of staff. Our biggest asset and our biggest expense is our staff members. Roughly, I think you might have stated it, about 73% or so of our total budget. Yep. Of that budget, were severely impacted by inflation, particularly this past year. You mentioned, I've been talking about the employees. They were impacted by inflation. We gave them a COLA increase, and we're also operating in a very tight labor market. I know it's been covered in the media and the business publications, but I'm there on the ground floor, and I'm telling you, I'm somebody who likes to experience in different ways, try to control costs. hiring contract employees, sometimes hiring part-time employees with no benefits. We've had success in previous years. This year is a very unusual market. Sometimes we were able to hire these people, but only for a short period of time. Either we had very few people applying, or we would hire them, and then another opportunity would open up in the market, and they would take that other opportunity. So we are competing with both private and government employers.
Right.
And as a result, the inflation, particularly for this area, we used a measure which we changed over the past few years to how we determine what that COLA would be.
Okay.
In the past, they would pick a month, and that led to suspicion from the stakeholders, meaning sometimes the council or community members, or sometimes the employees. Although there was nothing nefarious about which month was picked, it really wasn't the best way. So my team and I went out to the market to see if there was any best practices. And what we found out, most of these cities kind of very subjective on how they determine what that COLA would be. So we weren't able to develop a best practice, but we were able to, in our discussions, come up with a better solution that I think everyone can rally around. That seems to make sense. So we went to Social Security. How does Social Security determine what that increase would be? And they have a market here for South Florida market, which is also our competitors for employees, which is West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. And so we take the last 6 months of data. They issue these numbers every 2 months. And then so we don't have a spike on any one of those months. We average that 6 months of data. Unfortunately, it was very high this year. It was 8.9%. The council was very generous to the town employees. But we also had to mitigate the long-term liabilities to those expenses. So what we presented and what was adopted by the council.
With respect to the pension plan, is that what you're referring to?
I'm sorry, I should try to clarify some of these. I'm so used to speaking about some of these financial terms that may not be easily identifiable by the listener. But so with the 8.9% COLA increase, the council awarded 6.9% of that increase to be awarded in a lump sum, and 2% to be awarded to a salary. So there was a one-time expense in that lump sum. The employees were still able to receive that money in that year to cover the increase in their cost of living, their day-to-day living expenses.
Yeah.
But also protect the town from the long-term liabilities, which would be the increases to the pension, which would be quite substantial if we gave a 9%.
So, I mean, that sounds like a creative solution to me to mitigate the impact of the large COLA increase. On the pension plan, let's talk about pension expense. Sure. I know that for the fiscal year ended September 30th, 21, pension plan, I'll say, did quite well. It ended the year with about a 76% funded ratio. Mm-hmm. And partly due to market performance, I believe, last year, and partly due to the additional contributions that the town makes to the pension plan every year, $5.42 million. Mm-hmm. Of course, market performance since then has been worse, I'll say. Yes. Did the budget process consider adding an additional contribution to the pension plan this year, in addition to the $5.4 million that it has added in each of the last 5 years, I think it is? And what decision was made in that regard?
With the additional revenue that was presented to us in the formation of this year's budget, that was one item that was discussed. In addition, some new initiatives that were adopted, and also a reduction in the millage rate, which for some led to a tax decrease. As it relates to the $5.4 million extraordinary contribution, so for the listeners, again, I was going to say actuarially determined employer contribution, which is what the town is required to put into the pension fund, or some refer to as ARC. With the projections that are done by the actuary, in near short term, they're anywhere from like 12 to 16 million. But there wasn't enough money in the fund to meet the current liabilities. So the town decided to make this extra payment of $5.4 million to increase our funded ratio. As you stated, 76% was the funded ratio. We have a plan. That plan is in one of our actuarial reports. Some feel that 80% is considered healthy funding. And some of those projections, by the end of this decade, we would have funding upwards towards 99%. But as you stated, and as we all know, we had some bad market returns this year. So for the fiscal 2022 year, they just had a retirement board meeting the other day, and the losses during that fiscal year was 16.6 or 16.7% during 1 year. So that will affect that funded ratio. But they also have a policy which helps those market fluctuations or cycles, and it's smoothing. So it's a 5-year forward-moving smoothing effect. So if you average out that loss with some of the successes or increases that they've had in previous years, the actuary is going to have to determine these numbers, but we're probably positive 3%. But the actuary will come back with that report, but we're still going to be behind because our assumption rate for this year is 6.4%. I should really touch on that because I think that's an important accomplishment by the retirement board and the council. Okay. So in 2017, and since the retirement board, in conjunction with the mayor and council, made a smart decision to not only add this extraordinary above the ADAC of the $5.4 million, but they also reduced the assumption rate.
Assumption rate in terms of future
what the assumed return
returns.
is on the investments.
Right. So they're reducing it to a lower estimated yield going forward.
Correct. So it was 8%. I'll speed up until today. It's
Okay.
now 6.4%. There is a cost to that, and I'm proud to say we've been able to identify those costs in our budget rather than making transfers, which was initially done. So we were able to budget for those costs within our year's budget, and for each 1/10 of 1%, it's about $350,000, between $300,000 and $350,000 per 1/10. We're moving down by 0.2%, so upwards towards $700,000. We built that into the budget. The $5.4 million is not transferred out of reserves. That's built into the budget
Okay.
now and going forward, so we don't have to re-identify that money. But that also puts pressure on the funding ratio. So although it's a very good funding policy, because it's going to be an easier benchmark for the people that invest the money in our retirement board to meet that mark instead of 8%, which is considered to be unreasonable, to meet a benchmark of 6%. So the town could have less risky investment portfolio, and that benchmark should be easier to meet in the future. Very good decision making. But oddly enough, it has an inverse relationship to our funding ratio. So when we lower the assumption rate, it actually lowers the funding ratio. So the fact that we've been moving forward with the funding ratio is a very good sign. Like I said, the projections in the future will be fully funded. The council will decide in the future whether they want to continue the extraordinary contribution. But there's one more thing to point out on the future projections. Again, done by the actuary, not done by Kirk Blouin. I'm just repeating that information. And of course, those reports are going to change based upon the current information. But the required contribution from the town right now is going to be between $12 million and $16 million roughly. And by the end of this decade, it's projected to be between $4.9 million and $5.5 million.
Oh, so it's going to come down
eventually there'll be a
significantly.
significant savings. The town's invested for the future to close the gap until we can reach a healthy funding ratio. But the future should be bright for a retirement fund.
Well, that's good to hear. So that's a potential future opportunity with respect to budgeted expenses going forward. And one of the things I do want to cover is your view of future risks and opportunities.
Sure.
But before we turn to that, I also wanted to talk about the undergrounding project.
Sure.
A long-term project that's
Yes.
been under construction for a number of years. I think the budget in the new fiscal year ended September 23 is about $34 million. Total budget, I believe, is $120 million. $90 million funded by debt. I think we're somewhere in phase 5, maybe phase 6 of the project. What can you tell me about the status of the undergrounding project and the undergrounding budget? How will the difference between the total project cost and the $90 million funded by debt be financed? What can you tell us?
Let's see if I can put this all together. So currently it is $122 million is our budget.
Okay.
We had a shortfall of about $13 million from the original opinion of cost. Council adopted a policy rather than go out for additional assessments, which would upset the community. The fairest way is we're generating some good revenue, particularly from the marina. Matter of fact, I'll get into that maybe a little bit later if there's an opportunity. But we're able to peel off some of the newfound revenue from the marina, $2.6 million per year to be exact. The policy was for a period of 5 years to cover that $13 million shortfall. So that will cover that shortfall. You are correct in the construction phase, but in the funding phase, I think there's probably good news in this sense. We just awarded phase 6 north and south to the construction manager at risk. So absent any significant hurricane or some other unnatural event, our costs are locked in.
That never happens here, right?
We will hope and pray it doesn't happen.
Right.
But so we're getting closer, and it's getting easier to determine what those future costs may be. So we really have 3 more phases left to fund and award, and that's 7 north and south, and then phase 8, and we'll be finished. We'll be finished with this project by 2026. In addition, we also put in for a grant, a $10 million grant for, I don't recall if it was for phase 7 or phase 8, but I'm being told we have about a 50-50 chance of being the recipient of that. Either way, there's no secret that the labor and construction costs have been going up, but I think we should come pretty close, or maybe even less than the newly generated opinion costs, particularly if we get this grant.
Okay. Well, let's hope we get it.
Let's hope so.
So let's see. We've talked about property taxes. We've talked about operating expenses, in particular comp and benefits. Talked about the pension plan. We talked about undergrounding. Before we turn to your views on future risks and opportunities, anything else that you'd care to mention?
I guess real briefly, in addition to the employee costs, as far as our capital costs, in addition to the undergrounding, which that is paid through assessments. So the property tax owners, for those that are already prepaid it, they get an assessment every year, and they have to pay that outside of our general fund. Our general fund pays for the easement and construction manager that's on staff. But as it relates to the town facilities and other infrastructure, we did finish a facilities assessment conducted by Kimley Horn. So they did an evaluation of our town-owned properties and buildings and assessed what the maintenance and improvement costs would be, from roof to air conditioning to everything. And we try to smooth out those costs so there wasn't spikes in any one of those projected years, so there's even funding for the next 5 years. We have the North Fire Station, which was probably our biggest cost, and we also led to a large increase in our budget this year. So it was one of our town-owned buildings. It happens to be landmarked. It's 100 years old. As it's being landmarked, it makes some additional challenges in performing the restoration. We transferred another $2 million this year to fund that. We're probably still going to have to do either a budget amendment or another transfer in a subsequent budget year to accomplish the rebuilding of the fire station and potentially new furniture and equipment inside of it. There's always ongoing improvements to our drainage and sewage systems.
Yep.
The roads are a good bulk of that as well. We also have coastal resiliency projects always ongoing,
right.
and there's a large budget in there, and because any one of these projects could potentially be large from year to year, we have to fund the project, and then upwards we put it for grants, and we've been very successful, but there's no guarantees on that, and receiving grant monies back from both the state and the federal government, upwards towards 75% on some of the projects. So we have a big, very large project this year. Again, we had to transfer some additional money into the fund. It's an $18 million seawall project that the town owns at Midtown.
When does that start? When does that has it started?
It's being designed and approved now, so
Okay.
I guess you can say it started, but the construction hasn't started.
That's what I meant.
It's still moving
Yeah.
through the approval process. The money's in there for the budget, and it's very much in need to be repaired, and that'll run from roughly Wells Road to like Gulfstream.
It's a big project.
That's a big project. We have another one on the books for next year, about $21 million in Reach 8.
Okay.
We
Never ending, right?
It's never ending. And in addition to the coastal resiliency, we do have a small amount of money that about $1.45 million that we put in each year for bulkheads and seawall improvements.
Part of the cost of living in Palm Beach.
Part of the cost of living on island, yes.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to get your thoughts on future financial risks and opportunities quickly. What's top of mind in that regard with you?
The opportunities or enterprise funds, we're running them like a business. A lot of people are critical of government, saying government can't do that right.
Enterprise funds, you mean like the Par 3 golf course?
Let me define.
Sorry,
yes.
Go ahead.
No, you were correct. I'm sorry. We speak this language here at the office, and sometimes we're trying to get this message out to the public and give them this information. It needs to be clarified. So in particular, we're talking about the marina and the golf course.
Okay.
So last year, and generally municipal golf courses lose money. They're losers. They get supplemented by tax funds.
I didn't know that.
Yes, I'm not sure there is another one that generates money, but ours in the past year, in fact, we just did a budget amendment to revise our revenue estimates. Added another $1 million back to our funds. So we above our expenses, we had a profit of above $1 million on the marina. Above our expenses this year's projections, we should add about $9.5 million. Not all that money is going to go back to the fund because, like I stated earlier, some of that's going to go 2.6 to the undergrounding. Right. We are paying off our loan. We have a 20-year loan at 2.25%. Pretty favorable financing.
Keep that loan as long as you can.
We're going to keep it as long as we can, unless the council directs otherwise. And we're also putting money aside for the future. Now, these are things I think are better financial planning before they relied on the reserves. And I'm not going to criticize that. That's one way to do it. But we're putting money aside to rebuild the marina for our children and our grandchildren's future. Because when we built this marina, there was only like $3-point-something million in there. By the time this marina will be rebuilt in the future or improved, we should have about $40+ million. At some point, the town may want to continue to stop funding that or continue to fund it, but they'll make those decisions out into the future. Opportunities. The ground lease, we've talked about this in the past. I don't recall if we're going to start receiving some revenue this and fiscal year 2023, but there's a long approval process for land use and getting a brownstone designation. So we got all the approvals. We have to close out the landfill. We did have some contamination on the ground, but everything so far is moving along very smoothly. That project's going to happen. That'll generate about $867,000 in its first year of revenue, and that's all pure profit. There's no other expenses. They're all paid by the developer or the leasee in this case, upwards towards $2 million in the latter years. There's a 2% escalator each year on that. That's reconciled every 5 years. A year 25, there's a whole new formula to base the new valuation on the value of the land. We expect that rent will increase. There are caps on that to what we could increase it to. So we have a very valuable asset. At the end of 50 years, the town will still own the land and all the improvements, and it will generate anywhere between, I think, 64 and 74 million, or 67 and 74 million. So we have 2 other properties that we have the opportunity to do the same thing. They're Class A properties in the city of West Palm Beach. They're smaller properties. We have a tremendous amount of interest in them. We haven't moved forward on them because we were still wanted to make sure that wasn't the options for a water treatment plant that was to be considered by the council. Other potential opportunities on the financial side is 2 other things come to mind. One is parking. About roughly half the spots in town is free parking, and I say it's because it generates revenue, but I don't think that's the driver for the decision making. In my opinion, the driver for the decision making is to maintain the quality of life and increase the safety and security of the community. Right now, in some cases, the town council is making great decisions, making a ton of improvements in this area, and they're studying that now. But the less people here, there's less incidents, and it'll also help pay for the improvements. It certainly generates revenue for the town to assist in other needs for the community. And then last but not least is one that we always bring to the table, and that is we don't just follow the old formulas. So restructuring is always an opportunity. Matter of fact, we just did a restructuring plan in my office where it makes sense. Sometimes you revert to the old model because it makes sense, but I never like to automatically fill positions. I want to look at if there's another way to restructure. Can we outsource it because that makes just better sense? Can we supplant it with technology? Now, I'm proud to say that we were able to do all these changes without hurting any employees. Most of them done through attrition or transfer of an employee to another part of town. We're going to continue that practice to examine opportunities as we move forward. Now, moving on to the threats. We always have things from year to year, and I know I've mentioned before in the past and really it's not a major financial threat. I mentioned code reform only because in any given year, when you tell me you have $1 million increase, that causes me a little bit of concern. But that's something we can handle. I think the biggest risks to the town right now are future funding and policies that need to be made by the council. Some really difficult policies that they'll have to consider when they're looking at sea level rise. Sure. So one of the biggest ways to mitigate the sea level rise is the improvements to the bulkheads and seawalls. And then there's a cascading effect, like say the area of the bike trail. That area then needs to get raised because you don't want to be peering over the wall and then adjoining properties. We've had the threat assessments done by Woods Hall. We're now in the implementation phases, and then the policy decision making. I don't envy the council members. They got some tough decisions to make. Right now, currently, we just maintain the areas that are public property for the bulkheads and the seawalls, but they may choose to adopt another policy. That's a significant financial implications for the town should they make that decision. Sure. And then the other thing, but it's not really an impact per se to our general fund. And as we're moving through the water treatment options for the town, and we've been going into fine detail and eliminating some options and adding new options as they're trying to explore every possibility, there's obviously some major expenses in mind, particularly if the town doesn't want to be a customer and they want to be an operator. But if the town chooses to be an operator in some fashion, that would be run as another enterprise fund. We'd have to do a rate study, and that would be billed to the customer based upon usage. If we continue under the franchise agreement that we're under now, we are under agreement right now, and I'm not telegraphing anything, so no one should read into this, but if we continue under some franchise agreement, whether it be with the city of West Palm Beach or the city of Lake Worth, those terms will all be spelled out in the contract, and basically we would remain as a customer. If we build our own desalination plant, again, there'll be costs, and we'd have to bond them. That may impact our rating by Moody's or Standard & Poor's, but most of those costs will be passed on to the customer.
I see. Well, we can save those topics for 1 year from today, and you could tell us what the outcome was.
I can tell you what the outcome is, what the decision making is.
Well, thanks, Kirk. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming in to share your insights into the budget process.
Absolutely.
It's such a complicated area, as I can tell from just listening to you. And I look forward to following developments over the course of the next several months.
Yes,
so
sir.
thanks again. Thanks for tuning in. Hope that you've learned something about our budget process in our town today. And we'll see you again on Studio 33480 very soon. Thank you.
Studio 33480 is brought to you by the Palm Beach Civic Association, our sponsor, Finley Galleries, and our viewers. We welcome your thoughts on how our programming can best serve our members and residents.